Welcome to another seminar organized by Abstraction. And let me briefly introduce the project Abstraction. That it's the main organizer of this event. Abstraction is a ERC, so it's a European project funded by an ERC grant that I have the honor to lead. And it's a project that deals with mechanisms of abstraction in mind, in language, and in creativity. The title of the project is Abstraction, Unlocking Meaning from Experience Through Language. Within this project, and you can see here a slide with the team members, PhD and postdocs involved in the group. Within this project, we organize various seminars. Some of them are focused on cognitive aspects, psycholinguistic aspects, about how we abstract, how the human mind is capable of performing abstractions, and some seminars are more computational oriented somehow, so more focused on how machines, how the artificial mind, but also how algorithms in general can model and perform abstractions. Today, so we have a seminar that is presented by Valerio Basile, which I will introduce in a second. The two main mechanisms that we address with the project Abstraction are these two variables. One of them can be labeled as concreteness, let's say, and it's focused on the differentiation between what we call concrete concepts and abstract concepts, and this is commonly the focus of cognitive scientists and psychologists who work on abstraction. The other mechanism is the difference between concepts that are very specific or very generic, and this is commonly the definition that computer scientists give to the notion of abstraction. So we have these two dimensions, and our goal is to cross them and understand how these complex mechanisms work. And today's seminar by Valerio Basile is, I think it's a methodological seminar, has to deal with, as he will explain, with what is called perspectivism in natural language processing, and basically variation in how linguistic data are collected and analyzed. So Valerio Basile is an assistant professor of computer science at the University of Torino in Italy, in the group Content-Centered Computing Group. He received his PhD from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And before that, he received his master's degree in computer science at the University of Bologna, so here, with Fabio Tamburini, who is here. And also his bachelor undergrad degree in computer science, still here in Bologna. He is currently area chair at StarStem and area chair at EACO, how do you say it? EACO conference. And so he's involved in different conferences and natural language processing communities. He was a postdoc researcher at Sapienza University in Rome within the ERC project MOOS, working on semantic parsing of natural language in a multilingual framework. He was also a postdoc research fellow in the WIMIX team of INRIA. His focus, let's say, are all things semantics, all things computational semantics, let's say. In particular, sentiment analysis, hate speech detection and analysis. He was the PI, or still is, the PI of Break Hate Down, founded by Compagnia di San Paolo, knowledge extraction, and so forth. So all things computational semantics, really. And what he's going to talk about today is this perspectivism movement, which is summarized, let's say, by the Perspectivist Data Manifesto that you can find online. But with no further delay, I leave the floor to Valerio. And thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. Allora, sai, fai tu.
Thank you very much. So let's see to have a full screen. This one. Yeah. Okay. So it's great. I can skip the first two slides. That's amazing. Because this was what Mariana just said. Basically, it's a little bit my path from. I come originally from this little town down there, and I'm not the only one in the room coming from there. And then, you know, I went north, south again, etc., etc. Indeed, I've done many things, semantics, in different shapes and forms. I also do, and I always have done throughout my careers, a lot of work with language resources, which is even more fit to the topic of today. So, what I'm going to talk about, let's just lay the foundation, the building blocks, so just to make sure that we speak the same language. So we're going to talk about language resources, and specifically annotated language resources, and what's going on when we create resources that we want them to encode some kind of human knowledge. And we do that through the process that we usually call annotation. I'm just saying this because there are several different vocabularies, different communities talk about coding, which is confusing to me as a computer scientist, but this is what we're talking about. So this is just an example. There are many kinds of language resources, as you know, but the basic elements are the same. There are some instances, some data that in natural language processing are expressions of natural language. They can be words, they can be tweets, I think, is this example. There can be sentences, documents, whatever. There is some phenomena that we want to annotate. There is some focus of our study. There's something that we want our annotators to say about the language. And the annotators themselves, they're human beings, usually. There can be one, there can be many, there can be thousands. There are many ways of doing this, but usually they are humans, because that's what we want to do. We want to encode human knowledge from the brain through the annotation into the data. And the way we try to do that in order to produce machine-readable resources is that we come up with some schemes, sets of rules and constraints in order to have some kind of formalized, you know, some formalism, better, to organize this data to make it usable through computer processing, right? So these are the building blocks. Now, I think that the way we, as a community, have been doing this for the past 20, 30 years is great. I'm not saying that it's bad, but it doesn't scale up when up, the direction up is meant to be when we are focusing on more and more abstract phenomena in language. And even better than abstract, we can say more and more towards the semantics and the pragmatic. In other words, when we are starting to look, and we are doing that as a community more and more in the past years, to phenomena that are more subjective to annotate, I've done a lot of work with hate speech, toxic language. That's where I got this first impression from. They're very subjective, and by subjective I mean that their annotation is subject to a lot of variability due to the, human variation. I mean, people are different; they have different backgrounds, right? So when we look at this kind of phenomena with respect to what we used to do 20 years ago, more technical and objective phenomena in language like grammar, syntax, this traditional methodology doesn't work as well as we used to. And I think it is time to address this issue in a more systematic way. And this is what I'm going to talk about, a possible, I don't want to say solution, but a direction that they're starting to bring the first results toward better methodologies for language annotation. Right. So why? But spoiler, this methodology is called perspectivism, or data perspectivism should be better actually, because we found out that perspectivism is a different thing by Nietzsche, which has no relation to this, but it was too late. Our paper was already on archives, or data perspectivism. What are the main motivations? Some of them I already talked about. So again, when we look at more subjective phenomena in language annotation, in a way, we are asking annotators for their opinions rather than their technical judgment on something. And the opinions are different, but when we create data sets out of annotation, we tend to aggregate. We have to aggregate somehow, and basically we go for the majority. That's what we usually do, right? Always do. And that means that there might be some minority opinion, but it doesn't mean that it's not important. Not say it's right, their opinions, they're not right or wrong. But the minorities are systematically left out, the minority opinions, I mean, in the traditional process of annotation. That leads to loss of data, generally speaking. It might be a good thing, but it also may be a bad thing. I think it's better to consider all options. The other thing is that many times we ask annotators for several reasons just to label, to give crisp labels to things, to phenomena, and the reality is not always black and white, especially when we look at some very abstract phenomena. So again, there's some loss of information here in this kind of discretization of human opinions, and the other reason maybe will be more clear later. The way we create training data now, then we use them for training supervised models, creates models that they give a prediction, sometimes very accurate, but that's it. We don't really know why they gave that prediction. This is the old topic of explainability. I'm not saying that we are solving that problem, but there are implications that are linked to this loss of information in the loss of material to explain the predictions of the models. So this is why I'm doing this. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'll try to be quick, but at some point, if you show me the time, if you say that I'm speaking too long, right? So I tend to get lost in this thing. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what is this theoretical framework, and then I'm going to just show you a few examples of a few different directions within the same framework. That is how we can model, how can we create models of natural language that take different perspectives into account, and also how can we automatically extract different perspectives from annotated data, and a little bit about how to rethink evaluation under this new framework. So let's start with the history. I'm starting with the history from my own perspective. So that's not a complete history of data perspective. This is what happened to me in the past, say, I don't know, almost 10 years. And actually, now that I think about it, probably it started right here, like next door, at a conference that was held in the other part of the university here in Bologna, about 2016, I think. It was a talk by Chris Welty. They just published a paper called The 7 Myths of Crowdsourcing, which, if you don't know it, go look for it. It's a brilliant paper, where Laura Roy and Chris Welty detail what were the problems, according to them, with crowdsourcing and the myth. So the stuff that we assume that's always true, but maybe it's not in the new generation of language resources, not only language actually, data resources in general, annotated data. And the first one of them, I'm not going to list them all, but the first one is the myth of the single truth. So this assumption that there is always one truth in terms of a phenomenon in natural language, and the goal of the annotation is to converge towards that truth. And that's almost true when we look at more objective phenomena, like there is 99% of the cases, there is one, I don't know, parse tree for a sentence, right? And by annotation, even if there is some disagreement, then you correct it somehow, you aggregate, and the goal is to converge towards the right answer. right? But again, when we are looking at different phenomena like sentiment, emotion, stuff that's more subjective, maybe everybody is right. You can have diverging opinions, and they're both right. You cannot say that someone is wrong just because they have a different opinion, or at least it's an alarm bell that went off, right? Right at the same time, we were working on a sentiment analysis corpus that then was used for a benchmark, a shared task for Italian sentiment analysis. Sentipo was the name of the task, was a task at Evalita. And for the first time, we were also annotating irony. So we were 6 people, just the authors, annotating polarity, subjectivity, and specifically irony. And I was working with very friendly people. Well, all of us were friendly, except me, maybe. But I still remember some screaming match over Skype because it was the old times. And then kept thinking, this cannot be right. We are scientists. We are not supposed to fight over, who's right or who's wrong in judging whether a tweet is ironic. There must be some better way of doing this. But I kept thinking about these kind of problems that were surfacing every time I was involved, and I was involved many times in annotations. And I see you nodding. In the previous version of this slide, there was actually written lots of nodding heads, and that's what I'm seeing here. And maybe also at home, people are nodding. Because this is, and I'm sure I'm saying something that you're all familiar with, right? But it wasn't until the pandemic, actually, the first lockdown, the summer of 2020, where work changed, everything was crazy, lots of noise, and at some point we left everything. I went to Spain. Shouldn't have done that, but I did. My family, and it was around midnight, the first time in years that the background noise was down. I was actually on holiday, and at that point there were people organizing a discussion track at the Italian Conference on Artificial Intelligence, and they were asking me to submit some kind of discussion papers. I was also looking for an idea for that, and suddenly everything came together, everything clicked, and I started thinking, okay, maybe it's time to sit down and write a sketch, at least a framework, a complete, comprehensive theory of all these issues and how can we actually attack them in a more systematic way. At the same time, but this stuff that I discovered later on, of course, I was not the only one thinking about these problems from different perspectives, and there is a lot of similar related work that now we are tying together, but all these people were working in isolation, including myself and people who work with me. There were people working with, from the perspective of the evaluation of models, machine learning models, trying to encode this variability into the loss function. There were other methods that were trying to gather information and model the diversity of the information contained in the disagreements, and so on. What I find interesting is that not only in natural language processing there were these kind of studies, but also, interestingly, in medical AI, in psychiatry, in all other areas of artificial intelligence. The medical AI one is particularly scary because they proved that doctors, medical doctors, disagree a lot with each other in the interpretation of medical documents, and they still go ahead with it. That if you think about it, it means that if you select randomly a different doctor, you get a different cure for the same syndrome, which can be frightening, but let's not think too much about it. So this is the premise, and so what's the actual theory? What's the idea? What's all the fuss about? So in the not perspectivist world, so far, this is what we usually do. Very highly summarized. Collect annotation from humans, we aggregate them. Most times with some variation of majority voting or something similar. And that's what we do. Right? We throw away the rest, we sweep the disagreement under the rug, that's noise, and we are happy. There's a very nice paper, I always like to cite that because of the title, but also the content. It's called Harmonization, Sometimes Harm. You know what harmonization is? The name that in some communities given to the process of agreeing, sometimes forcing agreement. Like we do not leave the room until we agree on every label. That's called harmonization, which is ironic, because it's not very harmonic as a process. And it sometimes harms, as the paper says, because it has an impact. And it's what we were talking about earlier, is this loss of information in harmonization. Instead, what we propose is we collect annotations, but we keep all of them. So we never aggregate labels. We never aggregate annotations. Ever again. Never. And then we can use all these words of extra information to train and evaluate models, but of course, it's going to be not easy. I actually had kind of a fact. Easy, right? But because it has an impact. We have to come up with new ways of training models. We have to come up with new ways to evaluate the models. Everything is different. So the idea, the starting point is easy. It's just basically this. Do not aggregate the labels. That's it. But then the implications are challenging, and we are still working on many of them. The rest of the talk will be ways we are working in that direction. Because the idea of strong perspectivism is that you keep that information that is contained in the disagreement all the way through the pipeline. So in training, in modeling, in evaluation, maybe in explainability, and everything else you do. We collected all these thoughts into a paper that was just actually published. It's not published yet, but the conference was earlier in February this year with Federico Tabizza and his student Andrea Compagnie, who was the guy from Medical AI. So we got together for that. And, but this paper has been circulating for a couple of years already on archive. And unknown, because this is one of the questions I always get. How is this different from just learning from disagreement? Because that's a thing. There are many other people, including myself, I also work in that direction, just using the disagreement as a source of informative data. Right? It's not different, it's one step beyond that. The perspectivist approach, of course, takes into account disagreement. It starts from using disagreement, but it goes one step forward in that you just learn from disagreement, you are acknowledging that there is disagreement, there are different people. The perspectivist approach aims at also modeling who the people are and why they disagree. So it's a little bit more. Say it's disagreement is halfway through. We're going to want to go beyond that. And also because not all disagreement comes from a systematic difference in human perspective. People may disagree for the usual reasons. We actually went through them into a position paper with many other people. It's just my name, but 8 authors here. It's called "We Need to Discuss Disagreement." There's all different sources about it. Barbara Plank talks a lot about this paper. One is disagreeing. So this is the general idea. This is the whole proposal. Sorry if you're disappointed, but it's a simple thing, I know, I understand. But you'll see from the rest that the implications are not always simple. Are you still with me? Good. So let's dive into the actual experimental work. So if you look at the dates, the first preliminary works I'm going to present to you were done even before I came up with the term perspectivist. Actually, it was Federico who did. But everything was brewing at the same time, right? I had this PhD student in Turin, Sohail Akhtar, who was working on hate speech. And he had this idea of that people that annotate hate speech should be the victims of hate speech. And so he had friends and connection into a very specific community, the Muslim immigrant community in the UK. So it's a very specific target, right? So I convinced him to annotate the same data set, and it's a data set of tweets about Brexit, very divisive topic, right, in English. But I convinced him to have it annotated from both sides. So 3 people of his community and 3 other people, we call it the control group, right? And we had a couple of papers on that, which I'm going to show you. So the first thing we did is this annotation. At first, we only had a few hundred tweets. We have it annotated by these two groups of people. There were 3 and 3 people, 6 people in total. But it's important they were divided. We knew who they were roughly. And we came up with a very simple measure. It looks complicated, much simpler than that. I actually have, I have a better slide that better summarizes that. And I'm sorry if the people at home do not see my pointer, but we can do this. Oh yeah, that's better. So how this simple index work? We call it the polarization index. You have all annotations on a phenomenon. This case is very simple. It's binary annotation, 1 or 0, yes or no. So hate speech or not hate speech, whatever it is. And crucially, you know the division of the annotation. You know that 3 of these come from one group and the other 3 come from the other group. And then you can calculate 2 different measures. You can calculate the agreement of the people inside one group and, of course, inside the other group, and also the agreement between all of them. And you can choose your favorite measure of agreement. We used some variation of, what was that? The P. Now we tested a few of them, and you can also use entropy, but whatever that is, a measure of agreement. The polarization index is a function of all this. That it's a number that is high if the intergroup agreements, both of them are high, but the intergroup agreement is low. That means that this P index, polarization index, is high if these people agree on something, the other group agrees on something else. So they do not agree with each other. Groups, right? And so that's simple to calculate. You do that instance by instance, and then you can take the majority, the average, or whatever. And this was our very first result. And you can see these metrics. The T1, 2, 3 are the people, the annotators from the target group, the Muslim immigrants in the UK. C1, 2, 3 are the people from the control group. And you can easily see that they agree with each other inside the same group, but they disagree from one group to the other, which was expected, but the signal was very strong, right? That gave us a lot of motivation. And we also tried an experiment on this in terms of classification, supervised machine learning, very simple, where we use this information, and don't go over the details, they are not important, but we use this polarization information gathered from the disagreement to manipulate the training set, just to see if you take this information into account, can you predict in that case it was hate speech, can you predict the phenomenon better? And the result is positive, is yes. And that means, again, never mind the specific details of this experiment, the important lesson here is that information, the disagreement, the structured disagreement between people is valuable. And you can model that, and you can use that information in your model, and you will get better results. So that was promising. It was a small study, data. We did a little bit more. I'm coming back to this later. We did a little bit more. We annotated a little bit more data, same way, 6 people, 2 different groups, tweets about Brexit, so same setting, just a little bit more data. But this time, we not only modified the training data, but we actually trained different models on that. So this was a new thing. So this is what we did roughly. We had the original data set, we have this annotation made by 2 different groups. So we could actually split the training set, but longitudinally. So we could create 2 different training sets, which are the same text, but the labels are sometimes different, are kind of like semi-aggregated. So this is an aggregation of the labels given only by one group, and this is an aggregation of the labels given by the other group. So there might be 2 instances in here with the same text and different labels, because these people might disagree with these people on that. And that means that we can train 2 different classifiers, and they will disagree sometimes, not often, but they will. In some instances, one classifier will model the perspective of one group, and the other classifier will model the perspective of the other group. And so we can get a result on the same test set from one perspective, from the other perspective, or even, that's something else we did, we can ensemble these 2 opinions of the classifiers back together. And in this case, we did it in an inclusive way, meaning the inclusive or way, meaning that if this classifier thinks that text is hate speech, contains hate speech, or the other one thinks that it's hate speech or both, then the ensemble will say that it's hate speech. And again, the results were encouraging, that in the case of hate speech, at least, if you take more perspectives into account, even if they may be minority opinions, still your ensemble of classifiers is more sensitive toward that phenomenon, and at least by the results. And by the results, let's not comment the individual, all the individual numbers, but where does it come from? From better recall, or better sensitivity of the perspective-aware model, because it may recognize hate speech according to different perspectives, at least one of the different perspectives, so it's more sensitive. And indeed, at least in the case of hate speech, this seems to work. Okay? I skipped a slide because maybe I'll talk about it later if there's time, but at this time we also found out that with this wealth of information, we can also use it a little bit for a better exploration of the data that may lead to potential in the explainability direction. We didn't do much in that direction, but it's something that is still there that we want to pursue more. So there is also an avenue for that. Good. So finally, we get to the present days, actually last year. All these results, which were very encouraging. We liked it very much. What do we need when we have an idea that seems good? We need money. And I know it's not very scientific, but that's how it goes, right? You know that. And we got it. We were lucky enough to go into a collaboration with Amazon Alexa. They have a research center in Torino, actually, and there was an internal selection process, etc. But they gave us a grant that I have the honor of coordinating now. And with that money, we did two things. We hired people, of course, and we'll present them and we'll introduce them in a second, and we annotated data. So these are the people that are working on this project right now with Amazon. There's a name, the project, it's called Populus, which is an acronym, but we forgot what it stands for. But it sounds good. But that's our project. So I just want to take 1 second to say the names of these people. So from left to right, there is Simona Frenda, Silvia Casola, Mara Mlo, Viviana Patti, Cristina Bosco, and Alessandra Cignarella. And the picture down is not all the people also from the Amazon team. So this is our group in Turin, plus there is an equivalent team in Amazon Alexa. And so all these people got together. Now we've been through 1.5 years of project. We've done several things, but I'm going to show you what we very recently, again, it's not published yet, but a work that has been accepted to ACL, which is the creation of a data set of a corpus, which is called EPIC, English Perspectivist Irony Corpus. So what do? We wanted to create a data set according to perspectivist principles, so without aggregating data, and possibly gathering some information about the people as well, because we know that that's useful then to model the perspectives. We decided to focus on irony. Irony is a highly subjective phenomenon that's very subjective to annotate. It's very latent. It's a pragmatic phenomenon in language. And also Alexa was interested in that, of course, because I don't know if you have an Alexa or one of these devices at home. I don't, but I've seen them. They typically do not get irony, so they are very interested in studying this particular phenomenon. So we started from English only. What did we do? We collected not many tweets. It's tweets and it's data from Reddit. It's actually short conversation. So every instance in the dataset is a pair of text. Is a text and a reply. It's a short snippet of a conversation, either from Reddit or from Twitter. There are not many. There are about 3,000 in total, because we are not interested in a long data set as much as we are interested into a broad data set. Also because with the newest language models now, you don't need so many, tens of thousands of instances anymore. You can do with less than that, but instead we choose to put the resources towards having more annotations, which is more interesting to us. So we collected all of this data, and they're English, but they're from 5 different varieties of English. By varieties, we just mean regional varieties. So it's taken from these countries, the Kingdom, the States, Ireland, Australia, and India. There's a lot of people declaring to be first, that English is their first language. That's the criterion we used. Because we used Prolific to hire the annotators, and we hired about 15 annotators from each of these countries. Then we had some more, and then we discarded someone based on quality, but more or less, we ended up with 74 annotators. Each of them annotated 200 short conversations, plus there was some attention check for quality control. So on average, we have 5 annotations from each of them, and they are balanced with respect to the countries of provenance. Everybody annotated text from all the other countries in cross-country way. We also have information about their self-declared gender, and the corpus is balanced according to that. That's something that you can easily do with Prolific. Yeah, and that's it. So we got a lot of data actually out of this. And so we started looking into it. This is actually what we asked the annotators. This is a screenshot of the interface. And it was you cannot do it easier than that. It's one binary question, and that's it. So we were showing the annotators the short conversation like it was a text, like it was an SMS, something like that. I'm showing my age here. Like it was a Signal or Telegram chat. And the question is, this is the reply. The question is the reply ironic with respect to its content? Yes or no? That's it. That's the only question we ask. It's important that we give very simple and direct questions, that the annotation scheme is as simple as possible. It was important for us, at least. We got, again, a lot of annotation. We started looking into it. These violin plots, I won't show them because they're beautiful, first and foremost. It was made by our friends at Amazon Alexa. This shows the distributions of inter-annotator agreements, but broken down by groups according to different dimensions. So we have several interleaving dimensions according to which we can divide the annotators according to their age, their gender, their nationality, even something else, like employment status. Not all of them are very dense. But what we saw from this kind of plots is that there's a lot of difference. You get 2 different groups of people. No matter how you divide the annotators, you always end up with like different data sets, very different data sets in any way. So we knew that we hit the spot here, that it was a good thing to put money to get more annotators, because the more annotators you get, the more variability you see, instead of converging toward one truth. But the reality couldn't be further than that. Then we started, because we're computer scientists, so we started training models, we wanted to prove whatever, but we didn't get hardly any interpretable result out of this. So we got this very confusing table. I'm showing it on purpose. I know that it's confusing, it's supposed to be confusing. It shows the results of some experiments where we model individual perspectives the same way we did with the previous study. So we train different models on these slightly different training data. Same texts, but different labels. And then we see how they perform either on one big aggregated held out test set or on the same perspective. So we want to see the younger generation data. Is that model performing better on the younger generation test set? Stuff like that. We didn't get anything very informative out of this until we started looking into, not into the performance itself, also because they are not comparable, they're different test sets, so how can you actually compare them? But when we looked at the confidence score as output by the supervised models, in this case, when I talk about supervised models, I'm talking about fine-tuning BERT or some other small, like today's standard language, pre-trained language model. And the confidence was different. The general picture that came out of this experiment was that if you train models on individual perspective data, rather than one big aggregated stuff, the model is more confident. Whatever it says, maybe it's less accurate, but we cannot really measure that. But it's always, almost always, more confident. That was very interesting. Somehow this got accepted at ACL. I'm very surprised that this confusing table, probably Simone and the others were very good at telling this story. But we took that lesson about the confidence, and this table, again, it's a lot of numbers, I know, comes from something that we are submitting. We're still in the submission phase, so we're working on another paper now for NLP. The deadline is next week. So please, no pictures. I'm kidding. You can. Where we took this idea of the confidence and we experimented with that. So what are we doing now in the new batch of experiments? Again, we are fine-tuning pre-trained data sets on the same data set, EPIC. Now, some of these lines are just baselines, but the last two ones for each of the models are the new experiments, and they are both ensemble models that ensemble the individual perspective aware models. So we train 11 different models, one for the, I don't know, Generation X people, the millennial people, boomer people, and also male and female, and also, you know, from different countries. All of these individual segments of the annotators, we take only the data from them, and we create a model out of that. So we have this plurality of models. Each of them includes one perspective, at least that's the hypothesis. And then we ensemble them, but the way we ensemble them is using the confidence. We have, I don't think I don't have a picture here. I was still working on that yesterday, sorry. But we ensemble them in a couple of ways. One is that we just take the model with the highest confidence. So whoever screams the loudest, we listen to them. That's my metaphor. Right? And the other one, we take all the confidences and we use them to weight this course. And that's, what does that mean? It means that a minority opinion may win if they are more confident. If you have 10 models, 3 of them says, oh, this is ironic, and 7 of them say, this is not ironic, but the 3 models are more confident with their predicting, this ensemble will go with them, with the minority. So we are not aggregating just based on the majority anymore. And this works very well. Now, we still have to submit this, get it accepted, so I have to see. But there's even more. We tested this. So this number comes from a test in domain. So we train on EPIC, we test on the EPIC, on held up aggregate gold standard. But we also tested it on a different data set. We tested it on a data set from Senegal on irony. And again, it works, same way. We did the same thing with the 2 data sets of hate speech detection. There is a very nice, very large disaggregated data set of hate speech detections for measuring hate speech. And also a previous time aggregated data set for hate eval. So we did the same experiments. And again, it seems to actually, the experiments on hate speech are planned to finish running like tonight, I think. So this is really work in progress. And but wait, that's more, let's see on something else. Okay, I'll get to that. So, yeah, this is the last slide on the modeling perspectives. We are, you see, working on them, but the direction seems very promising. The lesson is that we can model individual perspectives with the traditional methodologies of modeling. With some kind of ensembling, you can also leverage that information, and it seems to work quite well across data sets, across phenomena. So far, so good. How am I time-wise? Should I rush? No. Oh, I'm not rushing. Good. So, another related but different direction, right? So we talked about modeling perspectives. Let's talk about the other thing. So sometimes we have information about who the annotators are. That's the case of EPIC, the data set, because we ask them. But that's not always the case. Sometimes we don't know who they are. Maybe because we did some crowdsourcing, and for some reason, we know that there are different people. We have disaggregated data, but we don't know who they are. But even when we do, there might be some other dimension along which we can divide the annotators that may be more significant, more relevant to the phenomenon we want to annotate, that's not encoded in the metadata. So we started wondering whether we can actually extract automatically who these people are, the perspective of the annotators, instead of just asking them or getting their data elsewhere. And the way we started doing that is by clustering annotators. Based on what? Based on their annotation. That's the only thing we know about them. They answered our questions doing the annotation, and that's the only information we have about them. But it's a lot of information. We asked, for instance, in EPIC, we asked each person 200 questions about irony. That should be enough, right? So these couple of slides refer to actually to a preliminary work we did a couple of years back. Again, roughly at the same time as the other works on hate speech, slightly after that, 2021. So we were still working on the same kind of data sets of hate speech. This is a slightly different data set, not by us, by Davidson. It's published as an aggregated hate speech detection data set. But we asked Thomas Davidson, and he was very nice. He said, oh yeah, I have all the non-aggregated labels, and here, take them. So, because that's what happens, right? People aggregate their data, and usually they throw them away. I won't say names, but I asked the authors of very popular data sets if they still had, non-aggregated labels, and they threw them away. A lot of, and I think that happened to my own data set as well. I think Hateable is the most popular that I worked on. I don't think we have the original labels anymore. No. What was I thinking? I was not thinking in a perspectivist way back then. But anyway, sometimes they do, like Thomas Davidson, he did, he very kindly just gave us his data. And what did we do? So in that case, it was out of, you remember Crowdflower? It was a platform for crowdsourcing. We got annotator IDs, and that's it, no other information about the people. So we knew that they were different people, and that's all we knew about them. So we tried to cluster them with different techniques, not going into the details, but what we did is we did two things. One, we clustered the annotators based on their answers, based on their labels. And the other thing is that we computed some kind of correlation between the engrams or just the words that were more likely to elicit a positive class, so a hate speech annotation in this case, from both groups at the same time, in an attempt to explain who these two groups are, to describe the two groups of annotators that we clustered. So we were able easily to divide the annotators into two groups, but we wanted to know how they differ. And the only information we had in order to try to explain that is the words that they annotated. So that's why we calculated this kind of correlation. And what emerged here is that one group was very sensitive. We repeated that with six different data sets, and the result was always the same. One group was always very sensitive for a few very specific words in each of the data sets, regardless of the domain and the specific phenomenon or the language some of them were in Italian actually. And the other group was more general, was more uniform in their labeling. And the words themselves for each of the data sets are of course related to the phenomenon that was annotated in the data set, but they were always very specific. Like in the Brexit data set, for instance, the group that was very sensitive was sensitive to Islamophobic themes, specifically. Not just a matter of politics, like, yeah, of course, you can say, but this emerged from the data. Or the homophobia one, that was in Italian, coming from a project we did together with Archigay in Italy. And one of the two groups of annotators, they were very sensitive to words related to religion, which is related, but is not explicitly said in the data set, but it emerged from this kind of analysis. So there is a way of using the data you have already to describe who the groups of people are in your annotation. Because this is only possible because our data is not whatever data. Our data is language, and we can understand that. That doesn't happen with other kinds of data. You can apply the same technique, but you will get numbers. But instead with language, this special kind of data we work with allows us to do that. So again, that was a preliminary thing, but now we are doing the real thing, and specifically this is the work of PhD work of Maren. We ran the same experiment that I presented to you earlier, the one that we are going to submit to NLP, with the only difference that this time, in this experiment, the division of the groups, the division of the training sets, instead of coming from the metadata we have from Prolific, like gender, age, etc., is automatically clustered using the same kind of technique. You can just cluster the vectors of each annotators, where the vectors are composed by their annotations. There are many techniques of doing that. Now, one of these experiments is still running now. I just checked, so that's why I censored the numbers, they were not updated. But the rest shows that this works. Again, so even if the division of the people is given automatically computed, so without knowing anything about the annotators, except that they are different people, it still works. It works almost as well as our best model. It's slightly lower, but above all the baseline. So very excited about this. Waiting for the last row to finish computing. That's great. I think 5 minutes, and then we go to questions. So just a couple of words, also because I don't have other numbers to show. But just a couple of words because I mentioned it earlier. There's one thing that we left out so far, which is evaluation. In all the experiments, including the good ones that I showed you, we are still testing our perspectivist models on non-perspectivist gold standards. So we are still testing it the traditional way on aggregated data, right? Because that's what we can do, that's what we know how to do. So remember when I said we want to bring the disaggregated data all the way through the pipeline? We are not there yet. We are almost there, but we're still the evaluation block, right? Now we started discussing the problem of evaluation in the context of perspectivism as early as we started talking about perspectivism. In the position paper that I mentioned at the beginning, where everything clicked together, etc., we wrote the manifesto, etc., actually was about evaluation originally. It was about how can we actually model things. In that paper, I made a very small simulated experiment where I tested a few alternative ways of evaluating with a disaggregated gold standard. But there was, in that simple case, it worked somehow, it's a bit more stable, but it's very preliminary. There's other people have done something better in that direction. I don't think we are there yet. We talked about all the problem of the evaluation in the same position paper I already mentioned. One promising way is to use soft labels to evaluate using disagreement. This is an idea by Alexandra Uma in her PhD dissertation, I think it was last year, using basically, without aggregating in the training set, but also in the test set, then you can still use functions like cross entropy to get a final evaluation. Still not clear how to interpret those results, but it's a way at least of never really aggregating the data. This idea was implemented into shared task at Senegal, and we just finished, well, the first edition was in 21, I was not involved. We run a second edition now, just at this time, and also we just sent in the report basically. It was very highly participated. It was 17 teams. The first edition was 2. And we are using some of the data sets I showed. We're using the Brexit data set, for instance, in this edition of shared task. The systems were evaluated using these soft measures and disaggregated labels. All good. I don't think the work is done in that direction by far. There's a lot to do. There's no evaluation framework right now that also says something about who the people are, how to describe the perspectives, for instance. There's still nothing about that yet. There's Silvia Casola in my team. Actually, one of the reasons why I'm happy that she joined the team very recently is that she comes from the natural language generation area, which is an area in NLP where evaluation is very important, but especially meta-evaluation, so how to evaluate the evaluation procedures. So she's very eager to work on that after the NLP deadline. So we'll see what the future will bring us. Just a couple of final words. In the meantime, many other things happen. I'm not saying anything about that. We are running a workshop called the NL Perspectives. First edition was at ELREC last year in Marseille. This edition is going to be in October at EKAI in Krakow, Poland. Many people submitted papers either there or to other venues, but we try to keep in touch. There's a mailing list as well. So several other areas are finding connection with this budding community, if I can call it like that. There are several methods, but what I find interesting is that there are applications that I wouldn't ever think of. Like there are a couple of works presented at the workshop about perspectivist techniques for frame semantics annotation, which someday usually you would think it's a very objective thing, but apparently it's not at all. If you annotate in a very different language, they do it with Brazilian, they found that it's much more subjective than you would think. So it's an interesting thing. Another thing we did in the project with Amazon is that we actually wrote a large survey, but all the data sets that now finally are being published in a disaggregated way, and methods, etc., including ourselves. I showed you our data set in English, but we finished annotating the multilingual versions, 9 languages. I spent a lot of money on that. Amazon. So thank you very much. And that's very large. It's more than 100,000 individual annotations. That's for next year when I come back. Yeah. And other things. You mentioned the Perspectives Manifesto already, that the website. It's kind of a starting point for containing a lot of links. There's the workshop I already mentioned. There's also a mailing list. If you want to join, just to be in touch. And I'm going to teach a course on this together with Enrica Troiano this year at ESLI in Ljubljana. If you didn't sign up, registration is open. You should all go at least once in your lifetime. Very nice summer school on logic, language, and computation. And I think that's all. Yeah, thank you very much for having me here.
Are there questions?
I don't know what to do with the imaginary people.
Thank you, Valerio. You anticipated my question about evaluation. My opinion is not completely meaningful to compare a perspective output generated by an ensemble system following your perspective with the overview. So I think that the evaluation part should complete the schema quite soon in order to give the complete strength of the theory. From another point of view, groups are fundamental for one perspective that you presented. And that seems to me quite a problematic ways, because inducing groups by doing clustering is certainly a real possibility, but maybe in some cases it could not respect real meaningful groups in the data. So it's a trick in order to have more groups, because in perspectivist approach, you need groups by foundation in order to support the theory. On the other side, dividing groups of annotators on social linguistic parameters could be a mess, a headache, because maybe in some situations it's not simple. And maybe, well, in my opinion, clustering is not, well, maybe it could be very, very dangerous. It could be a first solution, but it seems to me, if I understood correctly, that groups are the key point for supporting the entire view. And clustering, they are typical, well, they are very delicate procedure for creating groups. Because then you have to choose if they are hard, soft, which kind of algorithm. They are very delicate in my experience. So what do you think about that, about this point?
Okay, so this clustering thing to abstract the groups. So you're right. You need difference in people in order to capture different perspectives. That's for sure. The extreme, actually, I didn't talk about that, but the extreme version of that is personalization. Is treating every individual annotator as a singleton, and there are approaches that start from that endpoint and then try to aggregate. We do the other way around.
Evaluation would be a mess at that point.
It is, indeed. But there's Lucy Fleck, for instance, who also signed the manifesto, who comes from that direction. And that's another possibility. So, yeah, indeed, it's a lot of work to find the right parameters for the cluster. There's Marem is doing like experiments on top of experiments for 3 months now. It's part of her PhD work. A big part is on the mining of the perspectives, and she's testing all of these possibilities. But I just want to point out that they're not exclusive to using information you already have. In the epic dataset, for instance, we know something about the people, and we are also testing this, and that's the good way of validating a cluster. When you have some information, you have a natural division of people because you ask them information, then you cluster them and you see if your clustering method matches it, then you know you're quite good. But indeed, it took months of experimenting with clustering. The other actual problem is that the crowdsourcing annotation are typically sparse, and that's a problem. It's even just a technical problem for clustering. It's difficult. In many cases, you have pairs of annotators who didn't annotate any single instance in common. So you need to refine your clustering algorithm quite well in order to capture that. I thought while we were thinking about refinements over this, exploiting the fact, again, that our data is not whatever data, it's language, and we know how to model language. So, for instance, we can assume that two people would have annotated the same instance the same, even if they didn't, just judging by textual similarity, for instance. So there is some leeway for improvement in that direction. About the evaluation thing, I know it was just a comment, but actually there's a lot to talk about there. So the first of the two things you said about the evaluation, I agree, I said it, I agree we are not there yet, definitely. It's the biggest open issue, I think, in this field, definitely. I think that, but on the one hand, evaluating with this agreement is half of the story, and that's kind of done. I mean, the semi-eval shared task proved that you can do that quite reliably. But I always thought that the key for a properly perspectivist evaluation is a different one, is the explainability part. is the part that we didn't really explore thoroughly yet. This is a 5 to 10 research plan. It's not something we're going to do next year. It's through explainability. That's where I think these models can show the full potential. So I repeat something that I think it makes things more clear. So far, we have models that say this is ironic or this is not ironic. I say ironic could be another label. What we are trying to build is a model that says this may be ironic for this kind of people. So, and the fourth part is what is important, is the reason why. And I think that is something you can evaluate.
Yeah, I see. I will try to clarify a bit better my point. You are working on tasks that are very culturally related. It's speech, gender, and so on and so forth. You know, I worked a lot on prominence detection in speech. That's a very linguistic task, okay? But very subjective. There is a big part of subjectivity because the simple agreement between annotators almost never reach the level of 90%. Okay, so there is a big space. In this case, I cannot imagine a division in group, because if you take British people to annotate British English, well, white female should annotate prominence in a different way about males, while older people should annotate prominence in a different way with respect to young people. Well, there are no clear groups, and maybe it's depending on the phenomenon you are investigating, maybe you cannot. Well, it's not, actually it's not a good way to define groups, because my group is very homogeneous from the point of view of the phenomenon you are investigating. So how can we apply a perspectivist approach in this way?
I think
clustering, well, it could give you a result, but you have to define how many clusters, of course.
I think there are two steps here. First of all, you should understand, and that's not easy, whether that disagreement really is a perspectivist thing or maybe not. It may just be a disagreement for other sources. And in that case, so I'm trying to clarify the difference. Sometimes disagreement comes from, so stems really from cultural background. And those are the cases where this theory applies. But if it comes from other sources, it may be sometimes the task is ambiguous, just difficult, or there are many other possible ways. There's that position paper at workshop, benchmarking past, present, future. That's the name of the workshop. We need to discuss, etc., talks about that, the different sources of annotation, of disagreement in annotation. So it might be the case that in your task, it's not a perspectivist disagreement, it might just be disagreement. In that case, I'm going to be honest, this doesn't apply. You wouldn't find any extra information. You can do that, but you wouldn't, I think, get better information from here. But if that's not the case, or as usually happens, the truth is in between, maybe some way, actually, that's where this clustering approach may benefit you. So you're right, you cannot say easily what is or what are the dimensions along which you might divide your annotators, but that doesn't mean that necessarily there are not. There may be, but maybe they are latent, maybe it depends on some hidden variables in their background somewhere. I don't think that might be the case, but it may be. And these are the kind of things that you might discover in an empirical way, bottom-up from clustering. Then on the technical level, I agree, you have to do a lot of experiments with clustering. It's always difficult to do, but I actually learned clustering from him. Yes, I remember the day, yeah. I implemented K-means, I was so happy. I showed him, yeah. Thank you for that. But you could still try to apply that, and if there is some information, that's the only way to get it. Not necessarily.
I have a, thank you again, it was very, very interesting. I have a comment and a question. So the comment is, I think this goes toward having a more fine-grained, granular metadata, increasingly more fine-grained metadata sets somehow, which implies collecting a lot of metadata, social demographic data about annotators, about people. The opposite trend is the trend that protects data. So people are less eager to share their own data because of what is so the opposite trend, which is the ethics and the more also administration-wise, it is more and more difficult to say, okay, I need to collect this information about my annotators, this personal information about my annotators' backgrounds, because I want to explore whether there would be any groups that emerge from, this metadata. This is now is not how it seems to work anymore, because in many circumstances we are now developing an app, for instance, and for each and every question you ask about the background of the gamer, you have to demonstrate that you're going to use that information within the game logic. So you are asking how many books on average do they read every year. Why are you asking that? You need to prove that you need that information in the game. So, and then, also the ethic committee at universities, they tend to say, collect the minimum amount of personal data possible, just the data, the social demographic data that you need for your analysis. While it would be interesting to collect more social demographic data, even if you don't have a precise hypothesis and prediction on how that group is going to behave, and then see whether interesting clusters emerge. Maybe there is a cluster, people who, behave in a certain way tend to behave linguistically in another way. So it would be more interesting to collect a lot of such demographic data and see what emerges. But this is made impossible somehow from an ethic point of view, because you have to limit the amount of social demographic data that you collect and so forth. So I was trying to think, how does this approach, which I like a lot, but how does it connect with data protection, with limiting is that you cannot profile the users, profilate, not collect too much personal information and so forth.
It doesn't.
It doesn't connect well, right?
Yeah. Easy answer, it doesn't. It's true that we use every bit of data we get because we model all of the perspectives. It was not a problem at the time we collected EPIC, because the platform itself encourages you to ask that information. They already accepted those terms and conditions. Maybe an ethical committee, a particularly strict ethical committee would like to check whether we use all the metadata we have in our models. That's easy to trick, because you just run one more model and you can, but it might not be the ethical correct answer. It's a tricky problem. So far, I've seen I don't want to call it a problem. I think it goes into a direction that I agree with in general as a user myself. But I find that it's harder to collect information from social media user, for instance, like without really asking them. I understand why you don't want to do that. But if they're hired people, hired and paid fairly, because we also put attention to give you that information for a scientific study, and there's no personal information. So far, we didn't really have problem. I cannot see this trend going too much forward, because that would stop any kind of sociological research we are doing so far, so we wouldn't know anything about that. But as usually happens, we discuss about that, but the decision maker will do whatever the biggest American corporation tells them to do. That's what will happen. As far as they are collecting data, we are safe. Sorry if it's a bit dark, the reply. That's what I'm observing.
Thank you.
Or you can work in the United States where there are no regulations.
Or China,
You can do whatever you want.
Yes.
Hi, Valerio.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. I have a question and a small curiosity. Start with the question. It's about what, as you were saying, you're looking for minority in your opinions. But from what we have seen within your presentation, most of the time you have a balanced mix of groups. But what happens when you have a very small minority? You can still model it, or when the minority becomes a novice for the model, also for a perspectivist model. And I ask you also for the curiosity. You said that within the ABIC collection, you excluded some annotators because of quality. So why you exclude someone from a perspectivist collection? Probably the answer is that they were just saying or no or yes, but okay.
That's a good question. So I will treat them both as a question. So the first one, the balancing thing. That's not always true in our data. By design, at least on EPIC, some of these divisions were made to be balanced, particularly nationality and gender, because we could do that in the platform. But the others were not. Like age group, right? We don't see it here. This is just a plot, and I don't have a table. It's in the paper. I don't have here a table with the size distribution of these groups. But they're not balanced at all. Like by age group, the baby boomer cohort, for instance, in terms of age, much smaller than all the others. And but the thing is that the modeling doesn't care. You still model the same kind of. You still create a model that will output values in the same range as the others. So you somehow you give the same amount of voice to every perspective, even if they come from a smaller amount of people. And that might be a problem. We didn't realize that, but someone else did. There's a very recent position paper, I think, from, I don't remember all the authors, Zirak Talat for sure, there's Paola Fortuna and a few other people that worked on hate speech specifically, but are also, they also in contact with me, and they know what this is all about. And there was an interesting paragraph in an appendix about this theory, and that says it's great that the perspectivist approach wants to give voice to every group, to every segment of the population, even if they're a minority, but that includes people like white nationalists. Do we want to give voice to everybody? That's a position paper, in just a very strong question, but it hit me like a brick. I thought, oh shit, I didn't think about that, but they're right. So careful.
That's why clustering is very dangerous.
Yeah.
You have to define groups in advance.
I think the problem must be solved elsewhere though, because otherwise, if you start fiddling with your methodology to account for the data, it's a recipe for a disaster, I think. It doesn't mean that shouldn't be
you run the risk to use bias.
Yeah, exactly. So, but this is a much larger discussion here, and I'm not probably the best equipped person to talk about that. But with bias, do we really want data without any possible bias? Is that a possibility for starting? Yeah, I don't know. So it's trickier than it looks like. And the other thing was about was about quality. We excluded just a few of them. I think 3 out of 70 something people. because they failed the attention check. Because that's the other question. I'm surprised I didn't get that question because you're more experienced annotators, but in other venues, I always get the same question when I talk about this stuff, is that, yeah, but we use agreement as a measure for quality of the annotation. We have done that for 40 years. So you take this away from us, how are we going to check for the quality? That's not a silly question at all. It's a very important question. So you still have to check for quality with all the other means, depending on the platform. In this case, we have, well, Prolific is good in that respect because they are already vetted very thoroughly. Like, I tried to apply as a contributor, actually, to see what the process would look like. I was never selected. That was a year ago. Like, I'm not fit to annotate my own data according to the platform. Try that if you're using Prolific. Try to apply as an annotator and see how far you get. But there you can, we did have attention checks. They're just random questions that, in our case, they were very simple. They said, please answer yes, or please answer no. And if you fail a couple of them, you're either a bot or just someone clicking randomly. That's easy. There are other ways we didn't implement, or possible ways I found from the literature as well, that best way is paying people fairly. Otherwise, that's like it works with every other freelancing kind of gig work. If you pay peanuts and you get monkeys, I think that's the same how it goes. There are ways you need to control for that because we don't have inter-annotator agreement anymore. Sorry for your kappa. That's it.
Okay, are there questions from home?
Oh, there's people I know.
There are no questions from home. I think that it's one. So thank you again, Valerio, for the great talk, and thank you everybody for attending. The recording will be available tomorrow about this matter. Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you.